Hello learners, and welcome to the 53rd lecture in this NPTEL course titled 20th Century Poetry. I have been discussing something that I called the American Family Elegy. This is the tradition of writing in which we must situate the poems of Sylvia Plath. I will provide a brief literary historical overview and then try to move quickly to the elegies that Sylvia Plath wrote that were inspired by the death of her father, Otto Plath. To understand the early 20th century skepticism towards the elegy, we must note a character from Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This character is named Emmeline Grangerford, and she's intended to mock the tendency to write encomiastic, that is, highly praise-filled verse at the occasion of someone's death. This person has the amazing habit of writing elegies at a remarkable speed. Typically, her poems are complete with rhyme and meter set perfectly before the dead body has even been laid in the ground. It's only on the occasion of the death of a person named Whistler that Emmeline's habit comes to an end, because she's unable to find a word that rhymes with Whistler. Throughout the century, the frustration with and skepticism towards the elegy took various forms. One key complaint was that many poets had was that even as they wrote poems remembering their dead family members, they were not really able to get closure. Instead of providing closure, that is, a sense of acceptance that death is final and they have lost someone and they will never get them back, some sort of an acceptance of the finality of death. Instead of such closure, which is the point of healthy mourning, writing elegies seem to defer closure. So one reason why poets grew frustrated with elegies was that the form did not help resolve the problem, it made the problem worse. This is how the American poet Mark Strand writes about the death of his father. "Your shadow is yours, I told it so. I said it was yours. I have carried it with me too long. I give it back." This is how Robert Penn Warren writes about the death of his grandparents and parents. Robert Penn Warren writes that he wishes not just to reclaim, but instead to give back, to let go of the dead man who is locked inside his skull. And this man is obviously his grandfather, about whom Warren is writing the poem. In another poem about a dead mother and father, Warren asks the police to place a restraining order on the ghosts of his dead parents, saying that the dead need to be placed under surveillance. And this is how Warren writes: "They must learn to stay in their graves. That is what graves are for." So a growing frustration with how writing about dead people is creating a problem, and these poets would like to let go, would like to have their dead be away from them. Now, to recall briefly the British or English modification to the classic elegy in the early 20th century, we have seen Thomas Hardy call his wife indifferent. We have seen W.H. Auden call Yeats silly like us, and Freud at times absurd. These were in his elegies for Yeats and Freud respectively. We have seen William Butler Yeats refer to John O'Leary as a drunken, vainglorious lout. And we have seen Yeats refer to a dead uncle as nobody in a great throng. These were quite strong as criticisms go, because the elegy was not supposed to contain such writing. The elegy was supposed to praise the dead. And yet these early 20th century poets disagreed. They broke tradition. But these, while they broke tradition, were still very mild compared to what poets in the middle of the 20th century would do. Mid-century American elegists turned much more violently on their dead family members. The kind of aggression that poets like Sylvia Plath demonstrate in her poems about her father, for instance, would be unthinkable to poets like Hardy, Yeats, or Auden. But such aggression that we find in Plath's poems about her father was not so different and was almost of a piece with the kinds of confrontations that other poets, later in the century, contemporaries of Plath, did manage to stage between the speakers of their poems and their dead relatives. Additionally, it so happened that the most intense of these confrontations, the most powerful exchanges, feature the poet's own father. Poets who exemplify this style are Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Allen Ginsberg, Adrian Rich, and John Berryman. But things were not always the case, and this was still a very radical change. Now, in the American tradition, there is a minor tradition. In the history of American poetry, there is a tradition of poets writing about parents and specifically about fathers. Probably one of the earliest American parental elegy or American family elegy is that written by Anne Bradstreet, an elegy about her father. Anne Bradstreet, who was part of the generation of the earliest Americans, that is to say, the first generation of people who migrated from England and made a home in Massachusetts. In her elegy about her father, Anne Bradstreet showers high praise on him, saying that he was one of the founders of New England, was truth's friend, that he was humble, his thoughts were sublime, his actions wise, and so on. And in sum, Bradstreet concludes that he was pious, just, and wise. Further, lest readers suspect that Bradstreet's account was too idealistic or focused too much on her father's virtues and neglected her father's flaws, she gives the argument. She says that, for who more to boast his worth than I? Who heard or saw, observed or knew him better? Or who alive than I, a greater debtor? Let malice bite and envy gnaw its fill. He was my father, and I'll praise him still. The argument here is that she was close enough and had the authority of proximity. The argument is that because she was close enough, she was so close to him, she alone has the authority, the knowledge, and the evidence with which to demonstrate how good a person her father was. And because she's the only one who can write truthfully and honestly about what a good person her father was, she will do that. She will do exactly that. 3 centuries later, we find that the American elegists have turned this insight around. They still use the argument that proximity gives authority, but they use the authority gained by proximity to do the opposite of what Bradstreet does. Lowell and the poets that followed in Lowell's wake, that is Robert Lowell, the collection of poems that inaugurated the style is called Life Studies. Robert Lowell's Life Studies and the poets that followed in the wake of this collection used their proximity to point out the flaws in their parents and, in case of some poems, specifically their fathers. It's also important to situate these choices in the context of American society and culture in the years following World War II. The society was marked by a few features. On one hand, the average American citizen was encouraged to talk about their private affairs, including their relations with their family members, in public, in the form of talk shows and memoirs. On the other hand, funeral rites had become very superficial and did not allow for a sincere accounting of grief. Funeral procedures idealized the recently deceased individual. They sometimes projected smiling faces of the person placed with a background of stock natural scenery and accompanied by stock music. So poets gave way to anger and unpleasant feelings under the pressure to be candid about family matters. This was also a time when psychoanalysis gained public legitimacy, meaning that for the first time, a lot of poets found that they were forced to carry out honest grieving in the privacy of their therapy sessions or their poems. So the parental elegy became a particularly powerful genre, one that resonated with many, many poets, at a time when the discipline of psychoanalysis encouraged patients to find clues or the sources to their psychological problems in the history of their repressed relations with their parents. Like in a session with a therapist, poets often went back to scenes of their childhood in the pages of their poems. But this institution, psychiatry and psychoanalysis, too was perceived as being a bit too disciplinary, in that it sought to restrict and control the patient's relationship with their parent. And we will see a poet resisting very powerfully the disciplinary pressures of psychiatry and psychoanalysis in Plath's poems when she will refer very strongly to concepts like the Electra complex and other psychological ideas. The scholar Peter Sachs argues that in the 20th century, American poets wrote poetry about the dead in ways that made it harder to extract any form of consolation from these poems. But that is not the best way to approach these poems, and as I mentioned earlier, we have an example of a scholarly approach that takes a different stand, and that is given to us by the scholar Jahan Ramzani, who argues that instead of looking for consolation, readers of 20th century poetry will be rewarded if they approach these poems as offering a protracted struggle, a refusal to be consoled, and a struggle to reconcile themselves to the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of the lives of the people who have recently passed away. Like Hardy struggled to reconcile himself to the truth of his relationship with Emma, the speakers of these American family elegies too struggle to accept some inconvenient truths about particular members of their families, like parents who have passed away, and whose true legacy for their children remains an open question. Otto Plath, Sylvia's father, passed away when she was 8 years old. In her journals, Plath refers to him as, on occasion, the buried male muse of her writing. On other occasions, she also refers to him as a god or creator, which the figure around whom and from whom the energies of her writing emerge. So clearly, Otto Plath is a central figure for this poet. And we can find references to and inspirations from Otto Plath across Plath's poetry, and there are several poems which can be studied as instances of the particular line of inspiration or connection between this aspect of Plath's life and her poems. But there are 5 poems which I have selected as being particularly important and which helps us understand the progression and the development of the elegiac form, and which help us understand exactly how Plath reinvented the elegy in the English language. These are 5 poems, and they are Full Fathom 5, Electra on Azalea Path, The Colossus, Little Fugue, and Daddy. I will try to read a little bit from most of them, but depending on time, I may have to skip some portions. Now, in terms of poetic inspiration, Plath speaks of recent works by poets who suggested a new way of engaging with the dead through poetry. This way of engagement was not based on acceptance or obedience, but rather more on resistance. Poets whose work came closest to the kind of exploration Plath wished her poems to initiate were Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, both of whom wrote powerfully resistant and disconsolate and disturbed and disturbing poems about their parents. Lowell's most powerful poems are about his father, and Sexton's are about her mother. In an interview, Plath spoke of how she had been very excited by the publication of Robert Lowell's book, Life Studies. Plath was inspired by this book and was excited by it because it enabled what Plath called a breakthrough. This was a breakthrough into, in Plath's words, very serious, very personal, emotional experience, which I feel has been very much taboo. So for Plath, Lowell's collection was very powerful because it broke some taboos about what poets were expected to and allowed to write about when they wrote about their dead parents. Now, even though poets had broken taboos, no elegist had referred to a dead parent in the way, using some of the words that Plath had used for her father. And just a selection of these words include uh, danger, a barnyard, a barbarous butcher, and in her poem Daddy, words like fascist, devil, a vampire, and so on. Plath extracts and magnifies the elegy's potential for aggression. Now, traditionally, some critics have seen male and female elegists as doing different things. There's an expectation that a woman poet who mourns or grieves would behave in a certain way and write about the dead family member in a certain way. And it would be different if a male poet was doing the same thing, that is, writing a poem mourning for a dead relative. The expectation is that the female poet or the woman poet would be more accepting and would make connections, try to find connections between herself and the dead relative, whereas the male poet in the same role would act in a more aggressive manner, would be less interested in making associations and more interested in making accusations. This stereotype is something that Plath thoroughly challenges and in fact shatters to small pieces. A woman, a poet who mourns aggressively with anger and with many accusations, she fires a corrective shot at the male canon of elegiac poetry. In this canon, which includes all the biggest names in the history of English literature, from Shelley and Keats to Hardy and Spenser and pretty much every famous English poet in the English canon. In this tradition, women were relegated to a very few and very demeaning roles. Women in this elegiac tradition could be one of four things. They could either be ineffectual muses, distracting nymphs, inadequate mothers, or figures of death. No further role, no honest and sincere exploration of the complexity and the messiness of emotions was allowed to women characters. Plath's elegies for Sylvia Plath's elegies for Otto Plath may be divided into two stages. In the early stage, or in the early elegies, which were collected in the collection Colossus, we can find that they turn the rage, the negative emotional energies inward toward the speaker and the poet herself. In the later elegies, we find that this energy is turned outward at the person being mourned. We will see exactly how this plays out shortly. In the early elegies, the speaker of Plath's poems accuses herself of having caused her father's death, perhaps by her own excessive love for him. Literary phobias exist here as well. Emily Bronte, Alfred Lord Tennyson, they all did the same thing. They all wondered, while mourning for someone who had died, if they had caused it to happen by loving them too much. In Plath's writing, we see a very powerful combination of love and hate. And this is best explained by Sigmund Freud's essay Mourning and Melancholia, which I have discussed in greater detail early in this very course. I invite learners to go back and refer to that lecture if you wish to understand this further. Now, it just so happens that in her journals, Plath wrote about her reaction to reading Sigmund Freud's essay. And this is what Plath writes in response to Freud. She finds that in Freud's essay contains almost exactly the same description of her feelings and reasons for suicide, a transferred murderous impulse. And there's another quote from an interview which I find quite apt because it speaks to the strange combination of violence, anger, and longing, which is associated with the figure of the melancholic mourner, the person who is struggling with grief, and at some points, while processing that grief, turns to very powerful anger. This is how Plath described her father. This is how Sylvia Plath described Otto Plath in an interview. And I quote Sylvia Plath: "He was an autocrat. I adored and despised him, and I probably wished many times that he were dead. When he obliged me and died, I imagined that I had killed him." So this is obviously not meant to be taken literally, and in fact, it is a highly stylized statement, a highly ironic, poetic, and extremely stylized statement. It's made with a very calculated and strategic effect, and it is spoken for an audience that is fully aware of how poets think and how poetic language works. So obviously, when Sylvia Plath says that she imagined that she had killed him, there's a particular way in which she makes that statement. When she says that he obliged me and died, she imagines, she does not literally imagine that it was to fulfill her wish that her father died. In fact, she's describing the years that she spent struggling to forgive herself, if it was whether her hatred and her very personal and somewhat petty desire to see him dead, which actually became literal and led to his actual death. So it's this is a statement about guilt, and it's a statement about the difficulty that a poet has had to face, the difficulty of trying to reconcile herself to her guilt and trying to explain to herself and trying to forgive herself that it was not, in fact, her own feelings which brought about the death of her father. And additionally, it's also describing a deep source of contradictions which inspired her writing and which can be seen manifested in these poems. Now, in Freud's scheme, in some cases, a mourner is trapped with disproportionate amount of negative feelings for a deceased person. This pathological or melancholic mourning emerges from the conviction that the mourner himself has willed the death and thus deserves to be punished. So this is the contradiction that we can see playing out in the very first and throughout the writings that we will encounter. But let us now read the first elegy, which is titled Full Fathom 5. The title of Sylvia Plath's poem comes from Shakespeare, and the verse is from the play The Tempest, and it's titled Ariel's Song. This is from a speech that Ariel makes to Ferdinand, describing that his father Alonso has died by drowning. This is the speech in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Ding dong, hark, now I hear them, ding dong bell. So it's worth taking a moment to reflect on this poem as well, because it demonstrates the classical theory of the elegy very clearly for us. The speaker announces that someone has died. We also learn that this person has died by drowning and his body is at the bottom of the sea, has been processed, has been decomposed by the ecological processes at the bottom of the sea. His bones have become coral, his eyes have become pearls, and there's a statement, there's a theory for these changes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So the fact that that Ferdinand's father has died means that his body is undergoing some transformations, and these are good transformations. Uh, Something rich and strange emerges from the transformations of this body. And these transformations happen underwater. They are inside sea. These are a specific consequence of the specific manner in which Ferdinand has died. This is a structure which will be repeated throughout Sylvia Plath's elegies for her father. And the interesting thing to note is that the logic will be reversed entirely. So while for Ariel in Shakespeare, there is a rich and uh, wonderful change that takes place to Ferdinand's father's body, in Sylvia Plath, these changes are all for the worse. In fact, Plath struggles to find exactly what those changes are and how those changes can be understood and how she can process this loss better. And she will find that all of her curiosities, all of her efforts to achieve that closure will be frustrated. So, with that, let us read Full Fathom 5 by Sylvia Plath. Old man, you surface seldom, then you come in with the tides coming. When seas wash cold, foam capped, white hair, white beard, far flung, a dragnet rising, falling, as waves crest and trough. Miles long, extend the radial sheaves of your spread hair, in which wrinkling skeins, knotted, caught, survives the old myth of origins unimaginable. You float near as keeled ice mountains of the north, to be stared clear of, not fathomed. All obscurity starts with danger. Your dangers are many. I cannot look much, but your form suffers some strange injury, and seems to die. So vapors ravel to clearness on the dawn sea. The muddy rumors of your burial move me to half believe. Your reappearance proves rumors shallow, for the archaic trenched lines of your grained face shed time in runnels. Ages beat like rains on the unbeaten channels of the ocean. Such sage humor and endurance are whirlpools to make a way with the groundwork of the earth and the sky's ridgepole. Waist down, you may wind one labyrinthine tangle to root deep among knuckles, shin bones, skulls, inscrutable below shoulders, not once seen by any man who kept his head. You defy questions, you defy godhood. I walk dry on your kingdom's border, exiled to no good. Your shelled bed I remember. Father, this thick air is murderous. I would breathe water. So, a very powerful poem, but worth going over very quickly. And some key images and some key phrases I will briefly comment on before wrapping up this lecture. So, the poem begins with the assumption that the old man should surface, but he doesn't. Now, it comes from the very basic scientific and physical idea that dead bodies do not stay submerged, they come up to the surface. But this is a strange corpse because he does not come to the surface a lot, and he should. So this is strange. Further, despite being submerged, despite not rising to the surface, there's something about this corpse that has spread horizontally. And that is his hair, white beard, and it has become like a dragnet. It is so overwhelming and so widespread that the poet finds herself locked and lost in it, almost as if it is a wide and unending narrative, and almost like a text. Hair, again, is like sheaves and skeins, and this body now, it's so large. It has, something has happened to this body. It has almost spread out quite exponentially, and water bodies, ships and so on, which sail along this body, steer clear and move away from it. They do not try to fathom exactly how deep or how submerged this body is. So there is something very strange about this person. Further, the speaker notes that there's something about this body which dies, and there's some strange injury. There's a wound that seems to keep this body in the state of half decay, half decomposition. It's supposed to be decaying, it's supposed to be entirely decomposed, but it doesn't. It keeps spreading horizontally. And what exactly is that wound? The poet doesn't know, but seems sure that there is a wound. There are rumors of burial. The consensus seems to be that this dead person has received the necessary actions which are required to process all dead bodies. However, the speaker is not convinced that all of these processes, all of these rituals are complete, because she keeps noticing this corpse reappear. And then lines. There are a lot of lines that the poet describes. The face has a lot of lines. The body has a lot of lines, and the body keeps moving forward, moving all over, and something about this body does not make sense. Finally, the poet ends by saying that there's something in the shelled bed that she remembers, and she's trying to figure out exactly what this corpse mean. The speaker describes that she has ceaseless loving eyes, but still she cannot look much. She can only half believe the rumors, because he rises and falls with the tide, surfacing unpredictably. One thing I will note before wrapping up this lecture is that in this poem, the speaker gives us something that contrasts very powerfully with the work of earlier elegies. In earlier elegies, the discourse of the dead, remembered by the bereaved, is accessible. Here, the dead father's discourse defies questions and prevents access. The key word is inscrutable. The speaker of this poem is in a state of complete and utter confusion about what exactly has happened, whether or not this dead person has gone through the expected processes of decomposition. I will stop this discussion here, resume at this point in the next lecture, and wrap up our discussion of Sylvia Plath in next lecture. Thank you.